It's Gareth's Whim box. It's Gareth's Whim box. Welcome to Gareth's Whim box, episode 2. Let me just put my guitar down again. I had to re-listen to my first episode in order to get that melody. Such a brilliant melody that it is. I needed to get it. I still haven't got my opening note correct, so I'm sorry about that. I think that's called Elysian or Lise or something, glisseing up to a note. Anyway, so welcome to episode 2 of Gareth's Whimbox. Thank you for those of you who have who listened to the first episode, and thanks for your feedback. I have set up an Instagram Instagram page or Instagram account, Gareth Whimbox, at Gareth Whimbox. Lots of people, well, a few people are following it, and that's great. Thank you so much. And as I said, I would encourage you, if you'd like, please DM me with some messages, responses, questions, feedback. Make it constructive. I haven't. Hopefully, I won't ever get into the stellar ranks of being uber famous and then get sort of lots and lots of horrible messages. Keep it nice. Keep it friendly. Keep it polite. But any feedback you'd like to give me is good. This episode should be shorter. I know last episode was 1 hour and 28 minutes, and that's excessive. I mean, that's an excessive demand on people's time. This one should be shorter. I think I underestimated, as I always do, and as I'm sure academics and poets and other writers who give readings can attest, that I underestimated the amount of time it would take me to read the last long poems. So here I am in central Bedfordshire, in my little office, looking out of my window. It's quite a grey day. In my headphones, I can hear traffic going across. I can hear the cries of anguish from the school pupils that are walking past, going back and forth to a school I live. But hopefully you won't be able to hear that. I think they're just anguished because they're adolescents, not anguished for any deeper reason. Let's hope not. Anyway, so yeah, I've got a few things to cover today. And last week I had a listen to my first episode, and a lot of the things today are reflections on aspects from the first episode, and just thinking about some of the things that I talked about, but also extensions of some of the things. But to go into a sort of radio mode, coming up on the show on BBC Radio Gareth's Whimbox. Coming up, we have mostly reflections on the first episode. Gareth looking at a list on his yellow papers, but we also have understanding all outlines of notions of taking selfies. We have more reflections on Walter Benjamin, the philosopher. We have a thinking about Paul Klee, the artist, and I have a theory that I'm going to put forward about Walter Benjamin's interest in Paul Klee, in particular Paul Klee's Angelus Novus, which I'm going to go into in a minute. And the end of this episode, so again, if you want to skip forward to about 20 minutes before the end of this episode, I'm going to read a little essay that I wrote called Pathology of Laterality and Linearity. And it was sort of commissioned a couple of years ago to write, reflecting on dyslexia in academia, actually. But I think ADHDers, autistic people, or DHDs, which that is autistic and ADHD people, might find some interest, and people with dyslexia or who are dyslexic might also find it interesting. So that is going to be the end mini essay of this episode. So if you really wanted to skip forward to that, I'd suggest probably around about 20 minutes towards the end. Then come to that. So to start with, I wanted to reflect on some of the thoughts that I started last time, but actually didn't finish. And that's an error. And at the end of this, just before the prelude to my little essay on the pathology of laterality, is what I'm describing it as, rather grandiosely, is thinking about how thoughts are distracted. And actually, when one is presenting essays, when one is presenting a show, or one is in conversation in a sort of professional context, one should always try and this is very polite should always try to finish the thought. But that's quite hard because we get distracted. But a couple of the things that I forgot to say is I started off my first episode talking about the choice of my title, i.e. Gareth's Whim box. And I talked about Whim quite a lot, and then which is ridiculous. I talked about my cheeky friend. But what I meant to say, and I didn't finish, was actually I originally wanted this podcast to be called Gareth's Inbox. But that sounded really dull. And I'm not suggesting that Whimbox sounds more glamorous, but at least it sounds a bit sort of a bit more interesting than Inbox, because the idea was Gareth's Inbox, what's Gareth been thinking about. Of course, I appreciate the sort of narcissism of expecting other people to be interested in what Gareth's thinking about. But as I say, this is a record of my thoughts, and some people might find it interesting. And so I'm happy to have you along for the ride. But yeah, so the idea of a Whimbox was that it rhymed with inbox, and also I love the word whim and whimsicality. Now, I think our word of the day today is going to be whimsical. So I have my Shorter Oxford English Dictionary, I think published in the 1970s here, the second volume, and I've got the page open. At the top of the page we have this wonderful word whimberry, which apparently is an alteration of winberry, the bilberry or whortleberry, which is interesting. So the definition of whimsical is this: full of, subject to, or characterized by a whim or whims, actuated by or depending upon whim or caprice. Caprice, that's another great word. Characterized by deviation from the ordinary, as if determined by mere caprice, fantastic, fanciful, freakish, from 1675. And then in 1748, there's a sort of definition, subject to uncertainty. Now, this being characterized by fancy, I quite like, or whim or caprice, or deviating from the ordinary is quite good. The idea that, we have regular thoughts, as it were, that ordinarify us, enable us to go about our business, shop for groceries, have polite conversations with people that don't deviate into challenging territories, and then the abnormal, the unordinary. And I suppose, going back to what I was talking about last week, our word last week, dilettante or dilettantism, I like the idea of disorderly thought, pursuing lines of thought. And again, that sort of touches really on the final part of this podcast, which will be about laterality or lateral thought processes. Some of in the OED we get examples, and here's a couple of examples for whimsical. One Sir Roger de Coverley, a whimsical country knight, Addison. The second one, this is interesting, from 1826. The Germans are whimsical animals by their appearance. I don't know who wrote that, but that's strange. Must the bread of life be ground only by the wind of every doctrine and whimsical windmills. That puts me in mind of Don Quixote, and Don Quixote was written in the 17th century. And or was it the 18th? Well, it's one of those. And so that windmills is from 1652. Of course, thinking of Don Quixote tilting at windmills, which is a form of whimsical pursuing his whimsical, magical romance, heraldic thoughts. So that's interesting. Whimsy comes after whimsical. So whimsy, related next next as flimsy to flim-flam, dizziness, vertigo, whim. Those vain attempts of flying and whimsies to passing the moon. There's also whimsy-whamsy, which I've never heard, and whim-wham, which is related to flim-flam, jim-jam. A fanciful or fantastic object. So a whim-wham, you can imagine our erstwhile leader Boris Johnson saying, "Oh yeah, the whim-wham, a fanciful, fantastic object, trifle, etc." Sorry if that was traumatic and triggering for people. So a whim-wham is also a fantastic notion, an odd fancy from 1580. One of the examples of this is, "I have spent £700 for her to learn music and whim-whams." Or from 1588, "Such blind, unreasonable whim-whams," which is a really nice way. So again, sort of a dismissive, whimsy is often used grammatically as dismissing something irrational or perhaps not rational. And that actually relates to a topic I'm going to talk about a little bit later, the way in which rationality, objectivity, particularly the scientific method, Enlightenment thinking, the imperialism of that, and how it sort of pushes out the fanciful, the whimsical. And I think Walter Benjamin is referring to that when he talks about the aura of the artwork. So our definition for today was whimsical, full of, subject to, or characterized by whim or whims, characterized by deviation from the ordinary, as if determined by mere caprice. So that's our definition for today. So I wanted to also, the second thing I wanted to talk about was to address my rather striking Gareth Wimbox image, which of course is a mirror selfie of yours truly, your humble host, before his mirror outside his bathroom with his phone in his hand, in profile, me sort of gazing at the lens, so it looks like I'm gazing at you out, and I have my Megadeth t-shirt on, and I have my tattoo of Paul Klee's Angelus Novus showing, and it's a selfie. Now, I wanted to talk about that really, because it's a strange image, and people might sort of think, oh no, here we go, right, this is another narcissistic podcast, which of course it is in many ways. Hearing my own voice, and of course my thoughts are very important, and people should listen to my thoughts, and why wouldn't they be listening to my thoughts when, it's not as if there aren't billions and billions of other podcasts to listen to. Anyway, I wanted to address this because I think the selfie is very interesting. I'm not going to have a hot take on this. I'm not going to have anything particularly amazing or fascinating to say about this. I'm a latecomer to the confidence of putting selfies up on Instagram, but now I embrace it with the alacrity of a attention-seeking, frog, in the sense that I do put selfies up now, pictures of me unembarrassingly, unashamedly, slightly unashamedly anyway, in pub toilets when I've got a nice outfit on, in inverted commas, or if I want to show people something. And I like the limbic, I like chasing that limbic feeling of people liking my image. I think the maximum likes I've ever got on Instagram myself, and it was individual image, I think, of me, was 52, and it's thrilling to this day to have received 52 likes. Anyway, we all do that. I'm not, and many of us don't, but a lot of us do. And but I think as long as we're perhaps critically aware of the fact that we're engaging with this thing, and how perhaps temporary the dopamine rush is of getting a selfie. But as I said, when I went on and off of Instagram a number of times over the years, and I've always sort of tried to give the impression that I'm doing a selfie sort of vaguely ironically, like I'm not fully engaging with it. But of course, that's just pompous, and so there's a very simple presentationalism to it, which sort of seems to demand a reciprocation from the viewer's gaze. In a sense, it's an objectification of the self, a self-objectification in order to get satisfaction from people liking me. But the image, so why did I choose that for my podcast? Well, it's a very good question, Gareth. Thank you. I don't know. I think the image was supposed to communicate a sort of whimsicality of aesthetic presentation and interest, i.e. nerdy glasses, or glasses that are for practical, a Megadeth t-shirt, which implies, oh my God, like, Gareth likes Megadeth. Like, that must be interesting. And then the tattoo, as if there's some sort of radicalism attached to it. But as we know, radical incongruence and inconsistency is a hipster's hexaity, as no one ever says. And by hexaity, by the way, I mean hexaity. Hexaity means that property or quality of a thing by virtue of which it is unique or describable as this, the thisness of things. So my stupid thing, radical inconsistency or incongruity of presentation is a hipster's hexaity. That is to say, what I'm saying is it's the typical, wearing a Megadeth t-shirt and wearing, I don't know, dress shoes and then a blazer on top of it, as if you're sort of communicating the fact that you're so rounded and you have loads of different interests and you don't care about being consistent, etc. So there's distrust there. I'm going to talk about metal, actually, and my relationship with metal and music a lot more in future podcasts. In particular, 80s metal, 80s thrash metal, including Megadeth, Metallica, Sepultura, Pantera, etc. They're very important to the formation of my life, and I think they're very important. That era, that epoch, that decade, the 80s in particular, was very important for metal. I'd love to talk to a friend of mine about this, and of more that anon. But before I get to the tattoo, I'm going to talk a little bit about selfies, because selfies have a much longer history than perhaps we would have realised. And I looked up this article on an online magazine called Rangefinder. And there's an article called 8 Key Moments in the History of the Selfie, which is by someone called Hilary K. Grigonis. So that's Rangefinder. 8 Key Moments History of the Selfie. And it's fascinating. The selfie has a long image. And of course, the selfie and his self-portrait, etc., was in portraiture for a long, long time, for centuries and centuries. But in terms of cameras, it has quite a long history, straight from the development of the history. The first, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but just a couple of them that I found interesting. 8 Key Moments History of the Selfie. The first one is a selfie of a daguerreotype from 1839 by Robert Cornelius. He's a beautiful looking man. And he sort of looks like a Regency gent. Very, very handsome. If Robert Cornelius had Instagram and put this up there, particularly with the grainy black and white, foreboding, melancholic look that he has, he's a hottie. He would be getting lots of likes. And so Robert Cornelius was an American photographer, and he took this daguerreotype of himself in 1839, and that was just 2 years apparently after the invention of the daguerreotype. Anyway, so that's 1839. That seems people, sort of photography people, according to this source anyway, seem to suggest that was one of the first photographic or selfies, reproduced self that was deliberately a reproduction of the self looking at the camera. Anyway, so selfies have been around for a long time, and there was a first mirror selfie using a camera called the Kodak Brownie, which came out in the early 1900s, which was a sort of much more mass-produced camera, obviously only available to people that had money. But the Kodak Brownie, so that there was a mirror selfie taken by a Kodak Brownie there. And the one thing that really, really fascinated me, which I'm going to come back to, is a selfie taken by Anastasia Nikolaevna, who was the Tsar, the Russian Tsar's daughter at the age of 1913. I'm going to come back to that, and she was using a Kodak Brownie as well. But apparently, according to this article, the term selfie was first coined in Australia in 2002 by some guy that was drunk and wanted to record this to his friends. And apparently, smartphones added selfie cameras in 2013. So cameras that were facing at you rather than facing outwards. And the Oxford English Dictionary named selfie the word of the year in 2013. And I've got the references here to the Oxford English Dictionary from my Oxford reference online. And selfie. So this is from the current version from 2015, but remember that this word got into the Oxford English Dictionary in 2013. Noun plural, selfie. Informal, a photograph that one has taken of oneself, typically one taken with a smartphone or webcam and shared via social media. That's interesting that selfie perhaps only becomes a selfie when it's shared via a medium. Otherwise, what is it? Like a self-in, or a selfish. It's selfish. Then the ish, the suffix ish is knocked off when it becomes an e when it's shared, something like that. Anyway, okay. This is a great. This is sort of I don't know. I've only got kind of an abbreviated version of the Oxford Dictionary, but it says shared by social media. Occasional selfies are acceptable, but posting a new picture of yourself every day isn't necessary. I think this might be an example of how it's being used, but that's it. Otherwise, the Oxford English Dictionary is sort of weighing in with its value system. So selfie is in the dictionary. Also, when I printed off the definitions, there were further definitions here, and they have a definition of selfie stick, the selfie stick, which I think in some, it might be Taiwan or elsewhere. The selfie stick translates as a narcissist stick. Obviously referring to narcissism, narcy stick, which I quite like. Anyway, selfie stick, definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. Noun, a device in the form of a rod on which a camera or smartphone may be mounted, enabling the person holding it to take a photograph of themselves from a wider angle than if holding the camera or smartphone in their hand. Yeah, again, so this is a use of it. Some concert venues have banned selfie sticks over fears they block the view of the stage. Yeah. Anyway, but oddly enough, I don't know why, but in my little list of definitions of selfie, the word derpy came up, which I absolutely love as a word. I think it's an American slang word, derpy or derp. So derp is the noun, derpy is the adjective, and you can also say derpier or derpiest to sort of qualify it. Informal, foolish, or stupid. I.e., they say some pretty derpy things. The lead character is a bit derpy. A derpy bathroom selfie. I see. So we're coming back to selfie here. So I suppose what I could say is in my image that I put on Gareth Winbox is a derpy selfie. Derpy bathroom adjacent selfie. There we go. And I probably look foolish or stupid, derpy, derpier, or derpiest. So Gareth, selfie is derpy. So selfie. So yeah, in the history of selfies, this article that I was reading, I came across this image of Anastasia Nikolaevna, who took a selfie of herself on the Kodak Brownie that her family had bought her in 1913. And it's a beautiful picture, and really, really interesting. And in the background, there's a sort of ghostly figure of one of her sisters, I imagine. But look up Anastasia Nikolaevna selfie and you'll see this beautiful picture. It reminds me of Lewis Carroll's pictures of Alice and things like that, which I'm not going to go into for obvious reasons. But yeah, it's a really beautiful picture. But then I read about Anastasia, which I didn't know anything about. But so Anastasia was one of the daughters of the Russian Tsar Nicholas II. He was the last emperor of Russia, who of course was executed, and she was executed along with her whole family in July 16th or 17th, 1918. And had a really, really interesting history. Let's just read some stuff. She was the younger sister of the Grand Duchess Olga, Grand Duchess Tatiana, Grand Duchess Maria, elder sister to Alexei Nikolaevich Tsarevich of Russia. She was one of the Tsar's children. Apparently the Tsar's children were raised very simply. I'm not going to give you a whole history of this. You can look this up yourself, but it's very, very interesting. But there were some interesting comments on her, that she was vivacious and energetic child, described as short and inclined to be chubby with blue eyes, is one description of her. She was apparently quite a daring child, and in this, what is it? What's called? Britannica Online Encyclopedia. Forgive me, it's not that. It's a version of Wikipedia, so it could be subject to other opinions are available. Let's say it says occasionally exceeded the limits of acceptable behaviour. Daring occasionally exceeded the limits of acceptable behaviour, and she was getting punished for her deeds. The reason I read that is because the picture itself, her face is very cheeky. It's sort of brazen in some ways. You have to look it up. The other thing I found really quite frightening and grotesque about it, and again, I'm sure all of you are much more learned than I am in history, but apparently the Tsar's children had weird associations with Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin, the sage, mystic monk, of course. And Rasputin sort of had access to their nurseries, and would sort of read them stories and talk to them and things like that. And of course, this precipitated quite a lot of rumours. But of all the young women in the family were sort of quite dedicated to Rasputin for some reason. And these rumours were persisting about quite what happened with him and the wife and the children during that time, which, I'm not going to go into any of this stuff, but it's very, very curious, this relationship they had with Rasputin. And of course, Rasputin was murdered in December 1916, and these rumours were still persisting with Rasputin. So there's an association there between Rasputin and others. But yeah, the children were in captivity from, I think, 1917 onwards, and they were kept quite well, but obviously they were living under the shadow of not knowing what's going to happen to them, and apparently the whole family was executed unceremoniously and summarily on either 16th or 17th of July, and some of the descriptions are horrifying. Anyway, but again, I'm not going to go too much into that, but it's very, very interesting. She's just, that picture is quite captivating, quite interesting, and the story behind it is frightening, and strange and odd, and very captivating. So, and this picture in particular has a history in the annals of thinking about selfies, which is interesting. So do look her up, Anastasia. But the final thought to this is that the selfie has a longer history than we perhaps might imagine. And so if anyone sort of says things like, "Oh, we're also obsessed with taking pictures of ourselves," it's only because we have the means to do so. People have always been self-obsessed and wanting to take pictures of themselves. Egon Schiele famously took a lot of pictures of himself too. And there's some beautiful portraits that he took of himself with angled hands. Egon Schiele is a person I would like to talk about another time, because I'm fascinated by his work. The last thing I would say about the image is that I have this tattoo. I'm not going to talk much about tattoos today. I like tattoos. I'm fascinated by them. I don't have many. I have 4 tattoos, I think. 5. 4 or 5 tattoos. And this image that I have. So the image is by Paul Klee. Now, Paul Klee was a Swiss/Swiss-German artist. I can't remember his dates. Let me look up his dates for us. Paul Klee. So his dates are 1879 to 1940. Now, Paul Klee, it looks like Klee, by the way, and the poet on whom I've written quite a lot, Veronica Forrest Thompson, of more in another episode, possibly. She wrote a number of poems in 1967 on what might be called ekphrastic poems, and ekphrasis means writing about a picture or writing on a picture, broadly put. So, for example, William Carlos Williams, he wrote lots of ekphrastic poems. Apparently, one of the earliest ekphrastic poems, arguably, is in the Iliad, when Homer describes some swords in battle. Anyway, so Veronica Frost Thompson wrote a number of ekphrastic poems, and in a reading of hers from Exeter, 1967, Veronica Forrest Thompson read one of her poems called "The Clown." She says, "This is a poem. This is based on this is what she sounded like when she was younger. This is based on a painting by Paul Klee." So it looks like Klee, and I'm not shaming her in saying that, because I used to say Paul Klee, but actually it's pronounced Klee. So Paul Klee was a really interesting Swiss-born German artist, associated with lots of movements of painting, including Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, and other sort of architectural and art movements. Some of my favourite paintings of his, to just list them off, I've written a list of the ones that I love. Red Balloon, Viaducts Break Rank, which is a brilliant title and also a fantastic image. Senecchio or Senecchio, Young Lady's Adventure, Southern Gardens, Revolving House, Highways and Byways. So some beautiful pictures. And before I get to Angelus Novus, there's also a wonderful image called Twittering Machine. Die Zwitzermaschine. He was trying to capture sound and the sounds of a machine in the picture. So Twittering Machine is really interesting. Very interesting in terms of seeing Twitter as a twittering machine. Twittering Machine is really, really interesting. It's described as a small flock of birds joined by a cranking mechanism. I can't really describe it, but I would urge you to look up the Twittering Machine. It's a very, very beautiful, beautiful picture, and just very odd, a very odd little machine. And I like the idea that he was trying to capture music in his work, and use colours and angles and placement to capture musical composition. And it relates or dovetails with, for example, Mallarmé in The Roll of the Dice. In some of his poems, was trying to capture a musical score. So his words were scattered across, un coup d'idée it's called. His words were scattered across the page. So there's a long history of artists, both poets and painters, trying to capture what music does. Ezra Pound thought a lot about that, about the distinctive features of poetry, distinctive features of music, distinctive features of painting, figurative art, plastic arts as well, and what they could do in essence that other artworks couldn't do. And of course, concomitantly, there's a thinking about how they might overlap. It's very interesting, and that goes back to this notion of ekphrasis, like how can a poem capture the essence of an artwork, particularly as a poem operates in time, whereas arguably a painting is static, despite the fact that our gaze goes over it in time. So there's an interesting dichotomy here. But yes, to turn to Angelus Novus. Angelus Novus so is this kind of melancholic, slightly amusing, slightly strange-looking caricature, I suppose you could call it, of an angel. And he created it in 1920. I'm just going to read some stuff about this. Angelus Novus shows an apparently aghast angel. So this is the historyofart.org on Paul Klee, just a paragraph from that. I don't want to rip anyone off. I'll show my workings. I'll say when I'm reading something. Angelus Novus shows an apparently aghast angel, eyes glued to an image of despair, stuck in a flying motion, neither going backwards or forwards. Is one description of it. Excuse me. Excuse me, sneezing. But let me describe it. So it's this odd-looking stick figure of an angel with kind of curly hair, looking to the side. His lips are very full. He's got pointed teeth. He's putting his arms up as if to sort of say, he's under arrest or, in shock at something. His arms kind of look like wings as well, but although they do have digits at the end of it, 5 digits each there. And he's got what looks like a little skirt on, but could be the sort of back tail feathers of a bird. And he does have bird-like or chicken-like feet. His head is much, much larger and out of proportion than his body. And it's a very striking image. Now I have a line, just the line drawing it in black on my arm. And you might say, why? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Now, Angelus Novus is, a really important painting for Walter Benjamin. Was a really important painting for Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin bought the picture for 100 marks in 1921. Remember, the picture was created, and I say created because I'm going to come back to how it was made. Forgive me. It's created in 1920. Now, Walter Benjamin, our philosopher, he found this painting absolutely fascinating and kept it with him for a long, long period of time. From each house to house, he would put it up. He would put up his painting, and he was inspired by it in ways that I'm going to discuss. So he moved it from home to home. And this particular painting is a very staggering painting, and it's very, very interesting. Now, in Walter Benjamin's thesis for a philosophy of history, thesis on the philosophy of history, which apparently was the last work that he wrote before he died. He committed suicide on the French-Spanish border, trying to flee the Nazis in 1940. And he'd written this thesis on the philosophy of history just before dying, and he sent the manuscript to his friend Hannah Arendt. So Hannah Arendt is the political philosopher born in 1906, died in 1975, was also a Holocaust survivor, and was mates with Walter Benjamin. So Walter Benjamin wrote Theses on the Philosophy of History, or on the concept of history, in September 1940, or just before September 1940, and he committed suicide in 26 September 1940. And essentially the thesis on the philosophy of history, which is collected in his most printed and most read book, Illuminations, for reasons I'm going to go into in a minute, because it contains an essay that's very, very, that every person in their humanities attending degree dog has read. But so he wrote this. It's collected in Illuminations, which was actually also edited by Hannah Arendt, by the way, before she died. And it's essentially the essay. It's an odd essay. It's rather like Adorno's, who was also Theodor Adorno, who was also a friend of Benjamin. Rather like Adorno's Minima Moralia. It's written in short paragraphs, although it's not. It's comparable to Adorno in its difficulty and crypticality, but it's not. It's quite different to Adorno in its mysticism. So Thesis on a Philosophy of History is essentially what could be described as either a critique of historicism, the pseudoscience perhaps of historical fact-finding and rationalism, or a critique of historical materialism, and it's probably both. And it's probably both. And the reason I say that is because each different paragraph does different things. For example, let me read the first paragraph for us. The story is told, number one, the story is told of an automaton constructed in such a way that it could play a winning game of chess, answering each move of an opponent with a counter move. A puppet in Turkish attire and with a hookah in its mouth sat before a chessboard placed on a large table. A system of mirrors created the illusion that this table was transparent from all sides. Actually, a little hunchback who was an expert chess player sat inside and guided the puppet's hand by means of strings. One can imagine a philosophical counterpart to this device. The puppet, called historical materialism, is to win all the time. It can easily be a match for anyone if it enlists the services of theology, which today, as we know, is wizened and has to keep out of sight. Benjamin is using a famous chess-playing device that's used in the 18th century. It was called the Turk. And what he's calling it is this chess-playing device, this kind of puppet master behind the system, as it were, is his analogy. It's understood for historical materialism. So historical materialism could, this system of thought or this mechanistic process can defeat any other argument, as it were. And what Benjamin is tackling here, I think, is the notion of a concept of historical materialism as being used by philosophers who perhaps should know better, and Marxists, actually, in some ways. He has an ambivalent and dialectically critical relationship with Marxism, or interpretations of Marxism, post-Marxism, as you might call it. He is how they use historical materialism as a sort of to defeat any other argument, i.e., everything is conditional, everything is presented in its historical context. What Benjamin is attacking here, I think, or at least critiquing here, is how concepts, even concepts such as historical materialism, which are supposed to be particular, can ossify into catch-all explanations for things, which can then delete the possibility of something like, for example, theological explanations or mystical, metaphysical explanations. So Benjamin, in Thesis on Philosophy of History, is critiquing how, for example, how certain concepts, as I say, sort of ossify into modes by which people reconsider history, which are kind of as naive or at least as limiting as others. That's all I can say about this really at the moment, is that let's just say he has an ambivalent relationship with both historicism and historical materialism in parts of this essay. But why is this relevant? Well, in this Thesis on the Philosophy of History, Benjamin actually very, very directly refers to Klee's Angelus Novus, the painting. Remember, he had the painting perhaps above his desk as he was writing this. And so in Thesis 9, very famous definition, we have this Thesis 9 contains an excerpt from a poem by Gerhard Scholem, who was also a friend of Benjamin's. So Gershom Scholem was born in 1897, died in 1982, Israeli philosopher and historian. From Wikipedia, we have here, widely regarded as founder of modern academic study of Kabbalah. Scholem was appointed first professor of Jewish mysticism at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So, on the one hand, Benjamin had friends like Hannah Arendt, Adorno, and Adorno in particular, very, very hardcore, sort of, perhaps in many ways non-mystical kind of thinker. And on the other hand, Gershom Scholem, a mystical thinker, interested in Kabbalah and gnomic, or not Gnostic, but sort of recondite, difficult processes. So he had these two conflicting friendships, as it were. Well, not conflicting, but perhaps he had different perspectives. Anyway, so the poem Thesis 9 starts with an excerpt from Whim, Angelus, a poem by Gerhard Scholem, or Gershom Scholem. Mein Flügel ist zum Schwung bereit, ich kehrt gern zurück, denn bleib ich auch lebendig, seit ich hat wenig Glück. Apologies for my pronunciation there, which translates as, my wing is ready for flight, I would like to turn back. If I stayed timeless time, I would have little luck. And Benjamin writes this: a clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. So he's describing this painting. This is how he pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past. Where we can perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole that what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. This storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned. While the pile of debris before him grows skyward, the storm is what we call progress. So many people have written about this excerpt, and I think this is one of his very difficult conceptions of history. And I think one of the key points that I get out of this, and informed by others, is that this is Benjamin's critique of enlightenment and the notion of progress, i.e. how and also the naivety of continuing in the same direction, i.e. facing forward rather than facing backward, to pursue a kind of linear trajectory of progress towards a putative notion of development and civilization, as it were, ever more civilized society. And if you don't reckon with the past, you don't face it, literally face backwards to the past and look at the wreckage, then that wreckage will just pile up and pile up and pile up, and it will continue to haunt us, as it were. And what Klee to Benjamin is doing, Klee's Angelus Novus is doing, is looking back and reflecting on this. There's broader arguments here, I think, about Benjamin's conception of time and linearity, and the fact that if you're entirely time-based, then you don't have time to pause and think out of time, transcendentally, and perhaps theologically, about the impact of, say, an idea of progress. So another take on that is to say that Benjamin conceives of Klee's Angelus Novus as facing the catastrophe and the wreckage of civilization and the wreckage of the idea, the wreckage that comes after too naively using the idea of progress, and facing it for us. And that's why on his face is this curiously, I think, distrustful gesture. People say it's melancholic. I don't think it's melancholic necessarily. it's almost fearful. I think the face is fearful, but he's almost this new angel is looking back on history in the way that we should. And so in a sense, what he's saying is we need to reconsider terms such as progress, but also terms such as historical materialism, if they are just used as explanations without a broader critical framework attached to them. So that's Angelus Novus, and that's Thesis on the Philosophy of History. But I do have one other thing to say, which is my sort of argument. And I haven't seen anyone make this argument, but I'm sure it's been made because it's obvious and there are tons of brilliant scholars out there. But one of the things I found really interesting in researching this for this podcast was Angelus Novus. Klee's Angelus Novus was what's called a monoprint. It was called a monoprint, which Klee invented or reinvented or played with this notion of monoprinting. So monoprinting is a type of printmaking where you sort of you have a material like a block. You have a block of I think he used copper, and it's an oil transfer technique. And you cover a piece of tracing paper with ink and then place the drawing underneath and then scratch the top of paper with a needle to make a copy onto the paper below. So you're sort of transferring one thing to another thing, and you're pricking. You're creating these kind of prints. So the idea is that you're transferring one to another. So it's a form of reproduction, but it's a reproduction which does not create exactly the same thing. I'm not being very articulate about the notion of monoprint. You can look it up, monoprinting. But it's a form of artistic technique which is used in printmaking. But the important thing about monoprinting, I think, and the takeaway here for me anyway at least, is that a monoprint is not you don't produce exact replicas. Each of these images is different from the next. So you're not reproducing an exact replica. Each is different from the next. So you're making unique prints. In other words, you're not just creating the same thing over and over again like a sort of Andy Warhol print. You're creating variations on a sort of original, but then the original is lost somehow. And so it's variations on a theme. So in other words, each one is unique. Each monoprint is unique. So it asks us the question: what if Walter Benjamin bought Paul Klee's painting in 1921 for 1,000 marks, his monoprint, then what is it? Is it a original, or is it a reproduction of an original? Now that is interesting, because in the other essay in Illuminations, which everyone has read, or many people have read, and if you haven't, I'd urge you to read it, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. Now, Walter Benjamin doesn't talk about Klee at all in this essay, but when I was researching this and thinking about monoprint, the Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is Walter Benjamin's essay about what happens to an artwork if you can reproduce it. What happens to this original, what he calls aura of the artwork. And so he sort of thinks about the notion of, if something is reproducible, easily reproducible, then what happens to the original aura of the artwork? So mechanical reproduction, he says in the essay, of art changes the reaction of masses towards art, and also changes our understanding of artwork, changes our understanding of things. As I say, he doesn't mention Klee at all, but of course Klee's painting was a mono print. So Walter Benjamin would have been thinking about this, about the reproducibility of this painting that is so pertinent to him. So this painting that's sitting above his desk, he would think about its reproducibility. And what would happen if it was reproduced, monoprinted again, pricked through on another bit of paper? Would it still be the same image, and would it still have the same affect or effect? Now, Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction is a very, very interesting essay. The more you read it, the more tricky it becomes. So when I was rereading the essay, I was struck by, recently, I was struck by how ambivalent Benjamin seemed towards this notion of the aura. So the idea is, if things are reproducible, then the aura of the artwork is lost, which sounds like a very reactionary, conservative conception, and in a sense it is. But in the reproductions process, so Benjamin's philosophy actually, it does contain a kind of sense of reactionary, it retains a sense of transcendence. How this artwork has something else that is not related to the material world. But Benjamin wants to refuse the sort of the fact that these things, this sort of originality, authenticity can be liquidated. So reproduction, in other words, liquidates authenticity. But he also, in this essay, I think, somehow distrusts the cultishness and the reification that is attached to notions of the aura. So rather like in other words, he uses the term aura in inverted commas, I think, or at least he uses the term aura in silent inverted commas, rather like he would use the term historical materialism. That is to say, he thinks it's a valuable concept, but if it becomes in and of itself a concept that then stops thinking, then it's no longer useful. It ossifies into a transcendent category that is untouchable. Whereas I think he's very ambivalent about this notion of reproduction. He thinks he's sort of he's thinking about mechanical processes, what it will do to an artwork. He thinks artworks do have auras attached to them, but he's not fetishistic necessarily about that aura. But he's thinking about the notion of originality. And my takeaway point here is that I didn't realize, because I'm naive and hadn't really associated this to start with, I didn't realize that actually that it was perhaps the notion that this beautiful painting that was so important to him, this beautiful monoprint by Klee was so important, informed the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction because it was a monoprint. It wasn't a standard, straightforward painting. It was created as a monoprint to be a sort of serial image with the potentiality of other things. And I think that's very, very, for me, that's very, very interesting that this Klee painting had much more impact on the production of his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. As I say, I urge you to read Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction and read it closely, because actually it perhaps doesn't, it might not be arguing what you might remember it argued. In other words, yeah. So that's the end of my thesis on the philosophy of the production of Angelus Novus and Walter Benjamin's interest in that. So where are we going? So the last thing I want to make before I turn to my essay is sort of reflecting again on the fact that I didn't finish thoughts in my first episode. By the way, have you ever noticed how there's a preponderance now for people to say so, a sentence initial so, which might be used as a filled pause, like so if someone asks you a question, you go so, in order to fill up the space so that you can make your thought. But actually, a lot of people have talked about this actually as so as a kind of signal that what you're going to say is relevant. It's not just a filler; it's a signal somehow. It's a kind of almost like a conversational prompt. It's a signal to your interlocutor that you're actually being serious. It's a really interesting word that operates in lots of different ways. Like it could be a number of different things. It has lots and lots of grammatical functions, for example. And there's tons of podcasts about this, actually. There's a podcast called Lexicon Valley, A Way with Words, and other sort of podcasts that have talked very recently about so, because it seems like a kind of non sequitur. It seems like something that it's annoying that you might hear, but actually has a very, very interesting function. So it's really interesting. It's a polysemous thing. It can be used as an adverb, a conjunction, a pronoun, interjection, or an adjective. And in its sentence initial form, so, it could be an interjection. It could be used as a coordinating conjunction. But some people have argued that it's more conceptual than grammatical, by which they mean it's doing a lot of work. It's almost pragmatic, and it's pointing to something that's just about to happen. So, that's finishing that thought. The last thing I wanted to say is I forgot one of my unfinished thoughts from last week, which I was kicking myself for not finishing, was that I said I write crypto-crip poetry, and I started talking about the word crip, and then I went off on a tangent about other words. I think it's important that I come back to this because crip, very, very briefly, crip, like the word queer, has been repurposed and reclaimed as a strong term that's been claimed by people with disabilities. And in particular, in disability studies, work by people like J. Dolmage and Melanie R. Remy Yergia, they have engaged with the notion of crip. So, for example, J. Dolmage's Disability Rhetoric and R. Remy Yergia's Authoring Autism on Rhetoric and Neurological Queerness engage with the notion of crip, queer cripness, and how it's a term of empowerment, or at least it's being used, it's being reclaimed, as I say, rather like the word queer has been. By the way, Authoring Autism by R. Remy Yergia is published under their original name, Melanie, or their previous name, Melanie Yergia, but I think they're now known as R. Remy Yergia. But yeah, so this notion of Crip-time, look up J. Dolmage, Disability Rhetoric, notion of crip, the using crip. And for example, in Melanie Yergia's Authoring Autism, they write about crip is to disability what queer is to LGBT. While each calls upon and is informed by the other, cripness and queerness cannot be reduced to stasis, but both resist the respectability politics that work to make marginalised people pro-sociable or governable. That's from page 85 of Authoring Autism. So the idea is that it's reclaimed as a way to challenge. So if it's in terms of interpolation, if someone says crip, shouts crip at you in the street, you shout crip much loudly back at them and reclaim the word until they run away, etc. That's the last thing I'll say about that. So the idea, when I said I write crypto-crip, I was engaged with this reanimation or reuse of the word crip. So we've reached that time in the program where I'm going to talk about laterality. So whimsicality I've been talking about, dilettantism I talked about last week. I've always puzzled with the notion of how my thought processes and my writing processes are emphatically lateral. And I wondered whether that was something to do with dyslexia, something to do with autism, something to do with perhaps ADHD in some ways, and whether that's a common prevalence. So a couple of years ago, as I say, I was asked to write a piece on a piece for a blog, and it was called Pathologies of Laterality and Linearity. The blog is called, forgive me, just looking it up again, The Dyslexic Academic. It's dyslexicacademic.com. And the last piece that was actually put up on in April 2nd, 2021, but my piece went up on February 17th, 2020. And so this is an interesting blog post. And so I wrote this essay for them, but I also read it out. And there is a copy of this floating around somewhere, but I thought I would read this. So this is going to end the podcast. This is my essay on pathologies of laterality and linearity. Nestled in a collection of poems published in 2014, there is a poem called Pathology of Laterality, with the dedication in memoriam clarity of thought. This is my poem, by the way. The opening lines to this poem read, "The means for thought assemble now, askance oblique through dimmed eyes, flanking by cursory sidelines and filtered through forethought, you come." End quote. The poem muses on what might be called the constraining ideology of clarity of thought, and how such a thing may either be a myth or just something that the speaker cannot fully understand or attain. In these opening lines, thoughts assemble, ready to be expressed, but they appear oblique and dim, with eyes looking at them distrustfully. Some thoughts are cursory, others a consequence of forethought, but they all clamour at the sidelines, waiting for the you of language to arrive and express them. With so many pre-thoughts and thoughts, it is no wonder that the language to express them, like a flimsy cake icing funnel of linguistic expression, splits and splurges out in various directions. Pathology of Laterality, the poem, proceeds to dramatise the effective psychological and downright cloacal strains and stresses of attempting to manipulate natural processes of thought, comprehension, and writing into linear patterns and codes. Against the tyranny and rationality of linearity, the poem suggests, the lateral workings of mind and language are pathologized, the more comfortable flailing of limbs in a hula-like dance, of straight-jacketed and bedlam-bound to wonky wail and waltz in safety and away from the sane society in linear lockstep. The closing lines of the poem amount to an ironic lament for lost life. Quote, "Look out from Wardour Street it strides, Whim glanced on a switchway to pride, ruminant, it's chewed and half-tried, its pathological laterality we must abide." End quote. In the distance, the speaker seems to suggest there strides a spectre of aspiration. It can just be seen, but like a memory, Whim means in the past, it rapidly fades. The aspiration is some kind of stridently and straightforwardly achieved clarity, but it can, paradoxically, somehow only be perceived by following pathologically lateral paths of thought and language. The speaker is struck between ideal aspirations to the linear walk of clarity and the deficient tools of thought and language to grasp these things. They are stuck in a present realization that the aspiration may forever be too far ahead or too dim to grasp. They are stuck, in other words, in a battle between thought and cognition on the one hand and language on the other. Looking back on this, my poem, from what might be archly described as wizened older age, I wince, not so much from the perspective of aesthetic judgment, but from the way in which my poetic expression contorts, buckles, and crumbles under the weight of the main theme of the poem. The theme being feeling marginalised, linguistically, neurologically, experientially, from what I knew from years of reading, researching and writing were the appropriate or desirable modes of expression. I simply could not do that, at least in poetry. This piece that I'm reading here, 500 words of which have already happened, is not a claim to any special marginal status. By the way, before I wrote this, I didn't have my diagnosis, my autism diagnosis. I knew I was dyslexic, but I didn't know at the time that I was autistic. So this piece is not an identity politicking plea and corrective to perceived lack of academic or poetic achievement. I don't feel particularly ennobled or emboldened by the struggles I faced in education and academia. I would revise that now, actually. All the special attention I had to give to certain tasks over the years without realising that there was an issue. Nor by diagnosis of learning difference during my PhD studies, i.e. dyslexia at Sussex, amounting to a form of dyslexia, among other things. Again, the among other things is significant here. I do not feel special, I say in this piece, or want to claim any identity that will mainline me into great jobs as some sort of ambassador of difference. To be honest, I would take it if it was given. But why am I here writing linearly about and around and about the subject of pathologization of laterality? If I'm honest, the intent of Pathology of Laterality, the poem, had nothing to do with dyslexia, but to do with distraction, and in particular the ways in which we are led to pursue ever more crass and useless lateral paths to fulfill rampant desires to consume. In a way, the poem is a diagnosis of the potential pathologization of consumers under regimes of advertising. These regimes rely on people's attention obsolescence as much as the goods that they sell contain inbuilt obsolescence. Being a lecturer of English literature for a number of years, I often remind my students that they need to cultivate modes of attention that are iniquitous and resistant to the types of fractious and frantically ravenous modes of attention cultivated under late capitalist and technologically ravaged conditions. So the poet's intention was not to describe individual cognitive and linguistic estrangement, but rather the cognitive dissonances produced by societies and cultures. Nevertheless, Pathology of Laterality does explore observations of what might be called my own amused self-hatred of my lateral and laterally organised thought processes and writing techniques, and how these were perhaps incompatible with the rationally and linearly organised academic worlds, work environments, and modes of writing I was so painstakingly and painfully trying to navigate at the time and now. I have already claimed that advertising and late capitalist cultures may promote forms of lateral pathology, where bombardments of distraction pull us away from the time and attention required for linear and perhaps more deep thinking. I've also claimed that, in the main, academic discourses in the form of essays, articles, papers, and even debates are necessarily linear. Academics and other writers of prose need to carve out linear pathways of argument, even where broader culture and society default to ever more lateral and hyperlateral distractions. Learning to argue and learning the skills to forge linear arguments is already a struggle for any writer. Such work is necessarily hard for all writers. Writing is a skill and one to practice, work at, and improve by reading and writing. But, given that these things are already difficult, how does an academic with a learning difference or difficulty navigate these contradictory terrains, while also accepting that these skills do not perhaps come as easily to them as they do to what might be or has been called neurotypical writers? It might be useful for those who do have learning differences or disabilities to accept that the contradictions I have outlined above do make things hard for everyone, and that it is fine to take time and space to work on the skills that others might find a little easier. But here is another thought. If our cognitive capacities and peculiar linguistic usages appear pathologically lateral within rational frameworks of writing, perhaps there are ways in which we, the struggling lateralites, can claim superiority. We already effectively, experientially, and linguistically battle with these contradictions as we navigate between broad culture and academic specificity. An acute sensitivity and critical engagement with these conditions perhaps puts us in a slightly stronger position to explain and understand the contradictions of the conflicts between linear and lateral pathologies. Maybe. And the final part of this essay, I reproduce the poem Pathology of Laterality in Memoriam Clarity of Thought. So this is that poem. The means for thought assemble now, askance oblique through dimmed eyes, flanking by curious cursory sidelines, and filtered through forethought, you come. Like so many decisions you awkwardly awaken, are half-life kindled in unorthodoxy, or at leasts, and the urge to such. Whose air apparent here fuels and mimics these means, you are, as ever, a caricature of decisiveness. Whilst you are attained through familiar passages to thought, you are only warmed up clarity, a mincing side dish claritas, sideways consumed. You are only obligingly digested and unfolded as solution, deciphered here like a colonic exam, a pitiful half-truths, puckered fruits but unfulfilling, enough of a view at least to cause a pathos, jarring enough to present in jars as such, and firm enough to persuasively command a cause and etiology in so many words. So very many words. Wearied with hiding and peeking out from eye-evading lines, you are vomited, discreet though, and with a certain dignity, the dignity of feigned certainty. You are, alas, the bolus under palm shade plopping with a plop on the plate of conversation, stealthy like a frog in the throat, you expectorant, cleaving a clearing before the alarm of speech. Materialise in a moment's politic after having paced the labyrinth halls of stutter and the grooves of a tongue tip, pathetically emerge naturally inaccurate, inarticulate as description. You, thought, are bowel forged, curved through, over and out from the erstwhile depths, settled on for seconds best. Look out from Wardour Street it strides, whilom glanced on the switchway to pride, ruminant its chewed and half-tried, its pathological laterality we must abide. It's Gareth, Whim,